British power, including and especially the power of the British Empire, was very important in ensuring that great evil was overcome. But as I say, how do we square that with some of the things that we discover about the end of the war? Some of which I think readers will be surprised about. There's a great quote from Salman Rushdie I have: something doesn't have to be true to be real. And I think that's very pertinent to Bose. His achievements don't have to be true to be real and to be really important, because enough people have chosen to believe in them and in him.
Hello. At the end of the Second World War, Asian colonies were desperate for independence. India, Burma, Indochina, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies all boasted independence movements that now demanded autonomy. But was Britain, which had fought a costly war against fascism and domination and won, willing to grant self-government to its former colonies? And what of France and the Netherlands? Joining today is historian Phil Craig, author of 1945, The Reckoning, as we explore figures such as Chandra Bose and General Kodendra Timaya, or Timmy for short, and the way Britain and her allies dealt with independence. Coming up, Al Murray joins the pod to chat his latest book. We have Martin Dillon discussing the women of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, and Damien Lewis joins to discuss the SAS and Great Escapes. Please do share with friends and family, but until then it's me talking post-war empires with Phil Craig. Phil, welcome to Aspects of History. A great pleasure to have you on. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Oliver. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So we're here to talk about, actually I should mention to listeners, you're a seasoned podcast. You run your own podcast, so I need to make sure I'm up to scratch, up to standard. It's the Scandal Mongers podcast, isn't it?
That's right. Well, I started it with my friend and yours, Andrew Loney, but for the last 6 months or so, I've been doing it myself.
Andrew's been on this to talk about a few things, particularly Duchess of Windsor and the Duke of Windsor. Yes,
Indeed. He's a busy boy.
And what's your latest episode that you've had? Bearing in mind, this will be going out right after your book's published.
Oh, actually, in that case, I don't know. The last one I recorded was about Catherine the Great with a wonderful Canadian historian called Carolyn Harris. I've got lots of scandalous pots bubbling at all times of all sorts of subjects, going back to Al Fayed, actually, as well.
Oh, right. I used to work for him. I worked for Harrods.
Did you really? Well, David Hopper, the lawyer for Vanity Fair, who was part of that first attempt to get the story out about the allegations, he's got a new book coming out, and he's actually already spoken to me once about what it was like to try and fend off the Fayed army back in the day. Incredibly interesting.
Yeah, I mean, he had a reputation when we were working there. You had to mind your P's and Q's and make sure you were, he would not like you if you had the wrong tie on.
Oh, goodness.
Yeah, but anyway, we're not here to talk about that.
We are not.
1945, The Reckoning.
Beauty.
Splendid front cover.
Thank you.
And it's sort of subtitle, War, Empire, and the Struggle for a New World. So I'm very much looking forward to talking about this. Because it's obviously also, as you acknowledge in the introduction, a bit of a hot topic from when you first planned to write this book. But just on the front cover, there is a British chap marching purposefully through the sea, whilst he's got some chaps behind him worrying about the baggage.
Yeah, he's an Indian Army officer. I don't know if it's come up on the proofs. He's an Indian Army officer in the British Indian Army. And it's from 1945. And I like to think of him as one of the main characters, maybe the hero of the book, a guy generally known as General Timmy, although that wasn't his full Indian name. But he's one of the kind of big characters I follow.
Yes. In the early pages, you've, I think, got a quote from a couple of historians. One is Robin Pryor and the other David Olusoga. And they really do kind of... I wanted to just speak to you a little bit about that, because I find this question around history so fascinating. Perhaps you explain what they are and what's going on there for the listeners, so they can sort of see what's going through your mind as you write this book.
I mean, I start with my introduction by quoting Robin Pryor, who's he's a mate and he's a brilliant historian of strategy. And he wrote a fantastic book, Conquer We Must, about British governance throughout the two world wars. And he says, I paraphrase, it was important to the future of the world and the hope of any kind of a liberal order emerging from the wars that Britain, however imperfect Britain may have been, was on the winning side. And I believe that. I mean, this is the third volume in a series of books I've called A Love Letter to the Generation That Won the War. And I do believe that British power, including and especially the power of the British Empire, was very important in ensuring that great evil was overcome. But as I say, how do we square that with some of the things that we discover about the end of the war? Some of which I think readers will be surprised about in the book. And some of them are not very liberal. And they don't sit very well with the propaganda that we're all familiar with, and the story of liberation and self-determination and setting a sick world straight, which I think is a Roosevelt quote. How do we reconcile the two? Olasanga has a lovely line, which I quote. Again, I'm paraphrasing to say, history isn't meant to make us comfortable. You're not meant to fit everything in to a nice preconceived hierarchy of values, goodies and baddies. It sometimes is confusing. It's sometimes contradictory, and you need to celebrate that and bring it forward. And of course, if you're going to do a full reckoning, which I guess is why I've called the book The Reckoning, I'm trying to kind of blend all that stuff together. It's not an anti-imperial rant. One of the things about it that I'm really proud of is I managed to get endorsements from people who are very much on the opposite sides of the overhyped, overheated culture war on history and empire. There are quotes in the book, in the opening pages. Nigel Biggar said warm things, and he's very much on the side of let's defend the imperial legacy and let's look at some of the good things that Britain did when it was a dominant global power. And Alan Lester, who is probably one of his most high-profile opponents and a fierce critic of colonialism of all kinds, also said some very nice things and said, there are things in the book he didn't know. And he spent half a lifetime looking into this stuff. And it's interesting to me. I mean, maybe that means the book is a centrist blancmange that tries to please everybody, but I hope it's not. I hope it's a bit more interesting than that.
No, it certainly is. I mean, it kind of gets to the heart of where history is today, actually, because, I mean, I grew up learning about the ancient world. And so I have viewed history through that lens, i.e., it happened and all the wonderful stories and all the horrible things that happened in antiquity just happened. And that's kind of how I view history, in that I don't feel sort of pride, but at the same
Mm,
time, I don't really feel shame either.
mm,
Um, I guess as you get closer to World War II, still fairly recent. It's within living lifetime for some of us. I mean, my grandfather fought in the Second World War. My other grandfather fought in the First World War. But yes, that pride and shame thing is something that I find unusual. And today it makes people so angry, history. And I don't feel that either.
no,
Either.
I sort of, we're living through an interesting cultural moment. We choose to remember things in certain ways, and we highlight certain things from the past, partly to kind of, I don't know, chime in with our current beliefs about the world today. So if you're of a particular political persuasion, you're perhaps more likely to think of history one way or the other. I try to kind of put that to one side. I just find this stuff interesting. I want to know what really happened. I want it to be warts and all. And I think in the book, there's quite a lot of that. There's a lot of emotional, positive material. There's stories of battles, of heroic actions, of decent people doing amazing things. But there's also some stories of what I call imperial muscle memory, some kind of dark agendas that were not acknowledged at the time. Although actually, when you dig into it, some of it was acknowledged at the time, and some of it was quite controversial at the time. But it's almost like in the years that passed, especially in Britain, I think Britain remembers the Second World War in such a weird way. Um, and I came to this decision when I did my very first book, Finest Hour, 25 years ago. We're obsessed with the idea of Britain being the underdog. This is Dad's army. This is the few rationing, the Blitz. We're clinging on by our fingertips. Oh my God, how will we ever survive? The rest of the world never once looked at Britain like that. Certainly, Britain's opponents didn't. And as we get towards the end of the war, Britain's dominions and especially subjects did not and never had. And it's when you start to look at Britain through fresh eyes, you begin to understand things. I mean, did you know, for example, Oliver, that one of the great national celebrations in Indonesia today is about the Battle of Surabaya, which happens in 1945, the biggest battle that the British Army has fought since the end of the Second World War, where the second biggest port city in Asia is flattened by the Royal Navy, the RAF, tanks, huge battle, British Indian Army, supported by Japanese prisoners of war who we released to fight alongside us. Okay, this is only a few weeks after the end of the war. And this city looks like Aleppo or Gaza. And it's an astonishing story that I bet virtually nobody in this country knows about, but it's one of the main national days of celebration in Indonesia. Now, Indonesia is a rising power. I think it's rather important that we understand that there are these historical stories that mean rather a lot to people in that part of the world. I talk in the book about Vietnam as well. I didn't know
Yes.
until I researched it, how the seeds of all these terrible Vietnam wars that went on for 30 years were really sown by us, well, us and the French, again using Japanese prisoners of war to rat on a former ally. Well, Ho Chi Minh was an ally of the Americans, but he had good reason to believe that he would be supported. He was very favorably disposed to the West. He wrote all these cloyingly ingratiating letters to Roosevelt, well, Truman, because Roosevelt then dies inconveniently. And nobody ever gets back to him. And suddenly there's an army coming to put the French back in their palaces. And he's like reading the Atlantic Charter saying, guys, didn't you just fight a war on certain principles that you seem to be? I mean, what's going on?
It
And then
feels like in Vietnam there were so many missed opportunities and
so
bad
many,
luck as well with the
so many.
OSS guy who was a big proponent of him being
He
killed.
was. Yeah, and later in the 70s, when the America's tearing itself apart over this war, they find all these memos and letters, and this never needed to happen, did it? But it's
No,
interesting though, because it's quite easy to point the finger at Britain for being, colonial mindset. But actually, one of the interesting themes is America's going that way too. It's not just the British who are backing away from the Atlantic Charter. The Americans are, even before Roosevelt dies, and especially after, because America is becoming a new kind of empire itself, and of course, ideas about communism come in. Then there's a Cold War coming, and this melding of nationalist and communist in the Western imagination just is so intractable and complicated. It leads, I think, to all sorts of bad choices. Although fundamentally, a lot of it, I think, certainly when it comes to Vietnam, was pride. In economics, yes, people wanted their plantations back, but I mean, the French really wanted to be glorious again, and Churchill and de Gaulle could agree on that, if nothing else. So that was interesting to
yes,
find.
certainly. So perhaps we could focus on, you've mentioned Indonesia. Why don't we talk about that for a bit? Because that's an area that was very unfamiliar to me. So you asked me if I'd heard of it. I hadn't until I'd been reading your book. I mean, this was a region of the world. I mean, Indonesia today, as you say, I mean, it's a huge power today. Is it the largest Muslim country in the
I
world,
think
I
it
think?
might be, yeah.
And
And I think we just joined a massive trade pact with it, and it's got a growing economy. So it's a very important part of the world. But actually,
yeah,
one of the things about Indonesia and many other places, which we don't like to talk about in Britain, is that when the Japanese sweep through in 42, the beginning of the war in the East, something happens which really makes us feel really uncomfortable today, which is an explosion of joy. People from all sorts of societies, the Philippines, Borneo, Burma, Malaya, certainly the Dutch East Indies, they're initially thrilled because people who look like them are driving the colonists out. And of course, we all know the Japanese then behave appallingly and they poison all of that goodwill in many cases. But it doesn't mean that that moment wasn't important. It was. And it certainly doesn't mean that the colonists will be welcomed back, because they weren't. And that manifests itself in all sorts of ways, some of which are pretty horrible. There's some serious massacres carried out against civilians by Indonesians and by the Japanese, sometimes in alliance with Indonesians. So it's messy and it's unpleasant, but it's a huge moment. And of course, then towards the end of the war, a lot of these places assume they'll be getting their independence. Ho Chi Minh, so obviously in Vietnam, does, because he's writing all these letters with his American friends who have been working with him against the Japanese. In Indonesia, it's a slightly more complicated situation, but
yeah. So that was part of the the Dutch East Indies, as it was called.
yeah,
So under the Dutch Empire, my wife's stepfather's Dutch, and so he'll be delighted that the Dutch get a mention. But they behaved themselves despicably, which is why I guess the reaction
It's an ugly little war, and we should. I have no idea why. I mean, actually, the British are involved and critically involved. The British Indian Army fighting, and then of course they released tens of thousands of Japanese prisoners of war also to fight. Some of whom killed. And don't forget, this is happening at exactly the same moment where all around the world the newspapers are full of stories. The survivors of the Japanese prisoners of war camps, the death railways, they're coming home and they're emaciated and they're telling these shocking stories of cruelty and civilian massacres that the Japanese had carried out. Maybe some of these same prisoners, who knows? And then suddenly we're giving them rifles. Mountbatten signs this off. He's the supreme commander in Southeast Asia. But even he's slightly stunned when he flies into Jakarta and he's taken in his car from the airport to the command bunker, wherever they are, some fancy hotel, and lining the road for mile after mile are Japanese soldiers. He just spent years fighting these guys. Now they're saluting him. I mean, it's slightly extraordinary, isn't it?
Does it not give, okay, so the senior leaders, Mountbatten, does it not give them pause to think, what are we doing here?
Well, it's a bit like that famous meme, isn't it? Are we the baddies? I should have called the book that. But I don't think we were the baddies. I just think it's complicated. Yeah, I mean, there's a debate in Parliament. I quote some of it in the book. And Attlee, who's now Prime Minister, the great Labour reformer, the great socialist, who had a history of anti-colonialism, he gets up and he tells he says a load of rubbish. I mean, weasel words, Churchill's favourite phrase. Basically, the government decided it makes sense to help the Dutch get back into power. Actually, the penny does drop with Indonesia, unlike Vietnam, because I think within about 2 years the British position changes, and then eventually it becomes obvious that it's not tenable. The people just don't want them. But yeah, there's atrocities on either side. The Dutch behave badly. The rebels behave badly. It's the Japanese behave. Everybody behaves badly. It's a right old mess. But it's just one of those stories that isn't really known about because it doesn't sit so comfortably with the way we like to think of the war, which is basically we're heroic underdogs and we go and save the world. Well, there's a lot of truth in that. But there's also other things you need to know for a fair reckoning, I think.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, how do the Indonesians view the West today?
I think they're pretty favourable, actually. I mean, Vietnam as well. It's amazing how these things can be forgiven. I mean, lots of my friends and lots of my American friends have been to Vietnam on holiday, and they couldn't believe how kind people are
Well,
and
we've just
welcoming.
had a historian on called Jeff Warrow, who's written a really good history of the Vietnam War, and he spent a lot of time in Vietnam, and he was explaining how he just couldn't understand the positivity having written about the horrors visited. I mean, what, 3 million killed during the American part of the Vietnam War? I mean,
Yeah,
3 million
and that's
civilians.
just one part of it. I mean, the
Yeah.
French one, I mean, all of this is seeded by this terrible decision to do what they do in 45. Yeah, it's astonishing.
And is this
Very,
because Churchill and de Gaulle, I mean, de Gaulle is very keen to restore the pride and honor of France, and Churchill wants a strong France.
Churchill and de Gaulle have these interesting conversations, and the various secret meetings and committees are set up to kind of, and it's partly anti-American too, because they're sort of everybody can see after Bretton Woods to cover that the new world is going to be dominated by the Americans. The dollar will replace the pound, the U.S. Navy will replace the Royal Navy. Britain's locked in a kind of debt trap because of the borrowing and the lend lease and all that stuff. It's very complicated, but effectively, both de Gaulle and Churchill want to try and hang on to as many imperial colonial properties as they can because they're going to need the money. And Malaya, there's not much fighting in Malaya at all. In the period I cover, of course, there is later in the 50s, as I'm sure you know. Malaya becomes one of the most valuable parts of the British Empire throughout the 1950s. The Malayan rubber is absolutely critical to keeping the books balanced. I think it's the single biggest British export to America for a decade is Malayan rubber. And the people in Attlee's cabinet, some of whom have got long histories of being anti-colonial agitators, they need the money and they're very happy to have the money. And it's interesting because it's still a racialized world. We forget these people. Attlee himself says things which will make you cringe. It's just natural to him. Yes, we believe in decolonization, but for the time being, it's best if white hands hold the reins. And he actually literally says white hands. Well, okay, he says countries that are more suited to rule, like, say, Scandinavia, he says.
Yeah, he's entering dangerous territory
The
there.
idea that the people who live in these countries should actually genuinely now be running them is still seen as kind of transgressive to some of these guys, even on the left, which I think is interesting. But I mean, again, it's we putting yourself into their position, trying to get beyond hindsight, seeing the world as they saw it, and remembering how they were influenced. It's part of it's part of what this is about too. And I mean, no more so than India, which is another big part of the book. And in terms of India, obviously, Indian independence becomes inevitable. But that's only really after some pretty bloody. I mean, the Quit India campaign of 42. It's the biggest insurrection since the Indian Mutiny, and they crush it, and they throw all of the constitutional leaders. That's the Nehrus and the Gandhis. They get thrown into prison, and there are thousands of people killed. I guess what really happens, and I tell the story through two men, Bose, who is the implacable enemy of empire.
Hello, Ollie here. Please forgive my interruption, but I wanted to let you know that at Aspects of History, we produce a digital magazine featuring articles, interviews, short stories, and book reviews of the best historical writing available. Authors featured including Ben Macintyre, Lucy Worsley, Andrew Roberts, and plenty more. An annual subscription is available for only $9.99. That's pounds or dollars. Yep, you heard that right. That's 6 issues for under £10 or dollars. Head over to aspectsofhistory.com to subscribe, where you can also gift subscriptions. Now back to the show. Yes, let's just could we just for the benefit of some listeners, we have quite a few in India actually. So I'm not sure what their position on Bose is, because he is an interesting character, and I know you've written. There's a sort of on social media. There's a kind of puppet version of, or there's this sort of version of Bose, but you write about him in quite a sort of nuanced way, which interests me.
Yeah, some of my Indian friends and advisors think I was too nice to him, actually. Bose is a fascinating character. As you say, today he is acclaimed as the hero of independence. Modi himself recently said as such, and there's endless schools and hospitals and statues. In fact, Calcutta's international airport's named for him. He was an implacable opponent of the empire, but he was also one of those guys who he's kind of halfway between being a agitator and a politician. And the British, there's always the invitation to talk. If he goes too far, he goes to prison, and he does several times. But he's also invited to London. He meets with the absolute top people from all the main British parties. He's being positioned as somebody that we can deal with. And there are lots of people after the war who end up running Commonwealth countries who had previously been thrown into prison by the British. It's a famous story when the Queen goes to some gathering in the 60s, and she walks into this dinner and apologizes for being late. And some prime minister from Africa says, "Don't worry, Mom, at least 6 of us know just what it's like to be serving at your pleasure and waiting for your attention." Because they've all been banged up. So Bose could be one of them. But to me, it's a character study. He becomes slightly obsessed, I think, with the dictators, Hitler, Stalin as well. The glamour, the fact that these are men in a hurry. These are men who get things done. And the whole everything that comes with it, the big marches, the paramilitary parades, the burning torches, the propaganda. He sees himself, I think, very much as India's version of that. And inevitably, perhaps, he starts to fall out with his mates in the Congress Party. For a while, he runs the Congress Party. He's that important. And they see him as a demagogue, and I think they're right to. And then when the war starts, and it's clear the British are doing really badly, he makes this fateful decision to basically embrace first Hitler and then the Japanese. And he has this extraordinary, dramatic escape from India, from house arrest, makes his way all the way to Berlin, and where he sits happily having tea and chats with the architects of the Holocaust. He meets Hitler, he's friends with Himmler, Goebbels, very, very uninterested in what's happening to minorities and Jews. But today he's the hero. And why is that? Well, I contrast him with this man, Timmy, who is this isn't him, but this is in my mind, this is him. He's the first Indian-born senior leader in the Indian Army. He's a brilliant man. He's also a nationalist all his life, very critical of Britain, friend of the Nehru family, wants to see the end of the empire, but doesn't trust Bose, doesn't trust the Japanese, and certainly doesn't trust Hitler. But just to show how very kind of pointed this is, Bose's own brother, who was another soldier, he breaks with him and goes, sorry, Timmy's own brother, who's another soldier, breaks with him and goes to follow Bose. So it's brother against brother. It's really intense. But Timmy, I would argue, actually does more to build the institutions that make independent India inevitable than Bose ever does. And that's this army. This army that, again, we don't really hear much about. I mean, Rob Lyman, of course, does with his wonderful books. But, this is probably one of the most brilliant military forces of the Second World War. And it delivers the most crushing defeat on the Japanese that they ever have.
And is it 2.5 million
Two and a
Indians
half
volunteer?
volunteer Indians, led primarily by Indians. I mean, at the very top, it's white people until people like Timmy come through. But as the months go on, it gets more and more and more Indianized, and they're very clear. Timmy's very clear. This is it. This is it. After this, you go, and there's no choice. I mean, there is no choice. Um, that is fundamentally why India takes its independence. Is the army is so strong and so powerful under men like Timmy. And I think it's kind of sad that Amazon Prime commissioned a 10-hour series on Bose full of, in my opinion, nonsense, over sentimentalized, totally exaggerated military triumphs, which never really happened. Or if they did happen, they are hyped beyond reason. But nobody's ever commissioned anything on Timmy for Amazon Prime. And if you're young and Indian, or young full stop, I guess it's an easy narrative, isn't it? If you're always the guy that was implacably opposed to the empire, and now that we all know empires are bad, then naturally he's the one you think is the hero. Whereas the man who had the more nuanced take, who had to live and experience it, who didn't want to make the compromises with evil that Bose made, he's kind of forgotten. Well, I'm hoping my book might help there, because I'm in touch with his grandson, another soldier. And I think amongst the military, at least, there's a lot of suspicion of the worship of Bose. But of course, the politicians love it. It's a lovely, simple story.
But during the war, the Bose's Indian National Army, the INA, they were fighting Indians of the Indian Army
They were not very well. I mean, they
alongside Japanese. I should
yeah,
add.
they fight with the Japanese against the British Indian Army to liberate India, because Bose believes the minute they go into action, there'll be a massive uprising. All the Indian soldiers will defect to him, and the people of India will rise. None of it happens. In fact, his military campaigns are unmitigated disaster, no matter how often, how well they're spun in Amazon drama docs. But there you are. He's the one who is now regarded by most young Indians, certainly the ones who are online a lot, as the hero. And you only have to dip your toe into this debate, and you just get dozens of people saying, oh, the Indian army, that was just mercenaries selling their souls to the evil Brits. Bose is the man. He's the man that really took independence. And
But
it is complicated, because you can understand, when Bose dies, and he dies very conveniently for his reputation. Because somebody else said it, much easier to like him dead than when he was alive. A lot of his soldiers come home. And there's a certain amount of how are they going to be treated? And actually, they're treated as allies who just took their enthusiasm too far. They're treated as Indian heroes in many villages, even by some of the men who fought against them. So it's, we need to understand that it's not black and white by any means. And I think a lot of the Indian soldiers who fought against the INA were, if not sympathetic, they understood why they'd gone that far. Even though, like my man Timmy, they weren't prepared to go that far themselves. So it's just a really interesting thing to write about, and fun. I mean, the Indian Army is a fun thing to write about. It's a uniquely kind of brilliant, but also slightly balmy institution. And there's various colourful anecdotes, some of which involve sexual scandal, which is always fun, because they was famous for that as well.
Splendid. With Bose, then, what are his achievements to mean that Calcutta airport is named after him?
Well, his achievements were, prior to the war, he was one of the great international faces of nationalism. He wrote a rather brilliant book. He went on global tours. He was acclaimed by intellectuals and artists and politicians. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He made the case to the world. I mean, others were making it, Nehru, Gandhi, but he was one of the great propagandists for independence. So you've got to give him that. And then I think it's because he just refused to compromise. And living in the time he lived, I think you can criticize that, and you should. But when people now want to support a team, you want to be on Team Bose or Team British Empire, it's quite easy, I suppose, to go with him. It's a very simple story, and he kind of anticipates this in his own writing. There's a great quote from Salman Rushdie I have: "Something doesn't have to be true to be real," and I think that's very pertinent to Bose. His achievements don't have to be true to be real and to be really important, because enough people have chosen to believe in them and in him.
I see. So Nehru and Gandhi, with their sort of suspending independence during the Second World War, that's viewed as a sort of a sellout then
Well,
for
no,
themselves.
but to be honest, they didn't entirely. I mean, they do launch the Quit India campaign, for which they're thrown into prison. But at the beginning of the war, they're prepared to work with the British and not go the whole hog with Bose. And then by the time that we get to the final year, it's just so obvious it's going to happen. It no longer becomes an issue. But I think with Bose, he's just one of those men. I liken him actually. I had a very good academic advisor, Ashley Jackson, who took out a few passages from the books. He said, "Phil, you're getting overheated," and I'm glad he did. But in one of those slightly overheated passages, which maybe I'll share online one day, I liken him to Robespierre. And there's a history of people who want to perfect humanity, no matter how many actual humans have to die. Pol Pot's perhaps another. Fanaticism, you know. It's simple, it's easy to understand, maybe even admire looking back. But if you're living at the time, it's bloody terrifying. And I think Bose sits somewhere in that. At least that's how I see him.
India post-war. I mean, Bose dies.
45.
So
He dies
with
in the
his,
final hours of the war, actually, and in an accident. He's not a casualty of war. He's fleeing. Well, some people say he's fleeing to Russia, but he's probably going to Japan. Anyway, the plane crashes and he dies. It's an accident. Uh,
and so what's the reaction of, I guess, political life in India?
it's much easier for them now to basically forgive all the INA officers and soldiers since Bose himself has gone. We just say, well, it was a surfeit of enthusiasm. Come back, join. You all patriots. We're going to build a new India. You're welcome. And some of the men who fought for Bose end up, in the establishment, sitting alongside some of the men who fought them. I mean, there's a lot of forgiveness, a surprising amount of forgiveness, because in the end, they all want the same thing. In the opening of the book, I talk about there's two Indian armies on the side of the Irrawaddy, and they both think they're fighting for the same thing. They're just chosen different allies. That's all. So
And
it's,
now
it's an
another.
incredibly interesting subject to get to really get your head around. There's a story. I love this story about the SS Corbis. I don't know if you got to that. This is tanker, and it's a lot of people who write about Bose mention this. And he's traveling in this submarine to Japan. It's a very dramatic story, and they sink a British tanker. And the story that's told is that as this tanker goes down, all the white officers get into a lifeboat, and all the Indian and Malaysian crew are just put into these cheap rafts, and they will die. To show how, even in the middle of a war, there's this awful kind of prejudice and racial hierarchy. Well, there was a hierarchy of race in the British Merchant Navy. All the officers were white. But I actually did a little bit of research into this story myself, or rather, lots of enthusiasts about the U-boat campaign did. And when you actually look at it, the account of the U-boat crew themselves doesn't mention any of this. And I actually got a list of the names of the people on board the ship. There were no Indians or Malaysians on board that ship. There were Chinese. And if you look at who survived, it's a cross section. What actually happened is 4 proper lifeboats were launched. 3 of them foundered. It was a very stormy night, and those people unfortunately all died. But it's such a nice thing to believe, isn't it? And I think maybe at the time he probably felt a bit, oh God, what are we doing? We're sinking ships that possibly have Indians on board. And so bias confirmation, we're all familiar with that, comes in. Stories that are just maybe whispered in the mess, amongst the U-boat crew. They get hyped up and exaggerated, and then you have a simple morality tale. Oh look, even they make the Indians drown. Well, there were no Indians on board that ship anyway. But it's just one story of many that, again, don't have to be true to be real about Bose. He attracts those kinds of stories.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It really is this part of the world. I mean, Burma as well, of course. So Aung San Suu Kyi, her father,
Mm.
allied with the Japanese to boot the British out.
Well, he allies with the Japanese to put the British out, but like a lot of people, he sees the way the wind is blowing. So in the final months of the campaign, he actually comes back on the British side. Uh, See, because the Japanese are very stupid. This is something that Rob Lyman writes about a lot. You know,
Yes, as a child growing up in the 70s and 80s, this army is presented as sort of quite brilliant, ruthless, and almost superhuman.
well, they were in the initial surge through Asia. They're unstoppable. Um, but they encountered so much goodwill amongst the people they liberated or conquered, whatever you want to say it, and they proceeded to squander it by behaving really cruelly, repeatedly. I mean, even poor old Bose. There's one part of India that is actually taken by the Japanese. It's the Andaman Islands, and Bose goes there, runs up the flag of a free India, and that was written about last year in the Times of India as an inspiring story of how Bose is such a hero. The first time a flag of this new country was raised over Indian soil. Fair enough. Within weeks of him leaving the island, 44 of his own supporters, members of his own party, were shot without trial by the Japanese. He was meant to have a governor. The world was told this is now administered by the INA. Nonsense. It was the normal kind of arbitrary rule of some rather cruel and mad people. And like I say, if the Japanese had been a little bit more restrained and maybe more strategic in their thinking, they could have had many, many more local people fighting for them than the INA. Even
Yeah,
with
what
the,
were the numbers? The INA
it gets
could
about
muster,
80,000, about 80,000. Burma
which
is
in the
up.
wider scheme of things is really not that many.
It's not huge. I mean, it adds a certain amount of useful combat power to Imphal and Kohima, which is the big time they fight. They don't do very well, but they do fight. In Burma, there are quite a few people fighting in an alliance with the Japanese too, and there's people from Thailand and other places who volunteer, mostly Indian expats. Um, but yeah, it's what we choose to believe. It's such it is a big part of the book. I start with Bose's first his first arrival on the public scene is a schoolboy, and there's a big argument in his school, and his history teacher is accused of manhandling a boy, whether he did or not. Nobody ever really knows. But it leads to a scuffle in the corridor, and Bose is expelled. I mean, he gets back in, but he is expelled temporarily. And this teacher's called Oton, Mr. Oton. And all over Calcutta and elsewhere, teachers are then Otonized in that they're attacked by their pupils in a great kind of flurry of enthusiasm for, stick it to the man. So he turns,
British teacher as
yeah,
well.
white British teachers are beaten up basically or threatened by their Indian students because Bose has riled them up and they want to make a statement about the world and the empire and so on. So yeah, he turns his man into a verb. And that's the time he becomes famous. So at the end of the book, I just write this. His public life began when he transformed a man into a verb. So what should his be? Bose. Option one. Success through personal sacrifice. Vindication after death. Example. It was hopeless, but they believed they could still Bose their way to ultimate victory. Similar. Sacrifice, martyr, prognosticate. Option two, willing to ignore evil for sake of ambition or fanaticism. Example. Yes, he saw the death pits, but by now he was far too Bosed to care. Similar. Rationalize, mitigate, overlook. And I guess I come down on the latter part of that.
I like that. Bosed, too bosed to care.
But it's I'm still a small voice, and obviously I'm very conscious that I'm not an Indian voice.
Well, yes, I'm expecting a huge amount of emails now.
I think you can understand. Bose has friends executed by the British, hung. I mean, for carrying out political assassinations. He's thrown into a drafty prison in Mandalay for years, which really wrecks his health. He experiences the rougher end of British rule very directly. And I say at some point, um, it's easy to think of our modern relationship with India, which is pretty friendly, and say, well, the British Empire, we always did it a bit nicer than the other. Well, no, we didn't. Obviously in the 18th and 19th century, we did some absolutely ghastly things. And even in the 40s, we did some pretty brutal things, certainly to Bose and some of his mates. But ask yourself the question, how do you judge it if you're living in the time? I mean, someone like Bose, had he been agitating in Germany or Japan, what would his fate have been? He probably wouldn't have been allowed to go to the top university in the country because the British let him go to Cambridge, or invited to London to meet.
He studied law there.
I think he studied history, actually. I'm not entirely sure. Nehru, I think,
Studied law, yes.
But again, it's part of that weird late imperial thing where the great universities and inns of court.
Well, Nehru went to Harrow.
Yes, he did. And Jinnah, of course, is trained as a lawyer in London. So yeah, there's this strange mixture of kind of a
Yeah, it muddies the
suppression
waters
and
of the black and white of British Empire being evil.
well, I mean, not many empires at that time offered those opportunities to their fiercest critics. That doesn't mean that doesn't justify 200 years of often brutal rule, but it may justify the decision of someone like Timmy in 1942. That's my point.
Interesting.
It is different, I think.
And so, what was Timmy's role in the new India post 47? I know you don't go beyond.
I do actually. No, I sort of coda. He becomes one of the most famous men in the world. He's always quite combative, Timmy. He falls out with people all the time. There's great stories of him not getting on with other officers, often senior officers. But he becomes chief of staff of the whole Indian army, and really important. And when the Korean War ends, they need somebody to go to Korea to try and supervise all the prisoners of war. And he's agreed by all sides, China, America. And he does a magnificent job, get lots of awards, lovely letters from Eisenhower, people like that, who's now president. So he's widely acclaimed. I think he resides about once every month from the government, and the prime minister just sends a letter back, saying, calm down, So he's a little bit like that, but he's brilliant. And he's still actually, even though he officially retires, the UN asked him back to come to Cyprus in the early 60s to look after a peacekeeping force. Because despite the fact that he was famously undiplomatic, he seemed to have this skill at dealing with opposing armies. Anyway, he's there doing a great job, and he dies suddenly. Still serving India, still a soldier, and a thoroughly great man, actually. I think there's a lot of colour about his life in the book as well. It's quite funny. And particularly good story about dysentery. That's rather amusing.
Yes, anything involving bowel movements. Yeah,
it's a winner every time. There's plenty of that in the book. There has to be, given the medical problems that everybody had. But no, I love Timmy, and I think that it's a great shame he's not as well known as Bose.
Well, I mean, hopefully this book will. Are you being published in India for this?
I am, yes, and it's a real thrill. My other books, and none of my other books have been. So I hope A, it'll do well, and B, it might create appetite for the previous ones. You never know.
Wonderful. Yes, I mean, you should try and go to the Jaipur Literary Festival.
I would love it. I would love it. I would.
Well, Phil, look, this is fantastic. Links for listeners, links are in the show notes for 1945, The Reckoning. Fantastic book. And thank you very much for coming on.
It is entirely my pleasure. And thanks, Oliver, very much for your time and your enthusiasm.
A pleasure.
I will see you soon.
Thanks so much for listening. Plenty more great history is on the way. And if you want to get in touch, please do either through Spotify, X, or you can email history@aspectsofhistory.com. But until then, thank you and good night.